I arrived at Stanford to study psychology. And one of the first things I did in my first year here, which was really stressful and difficult, like graduate school often is, I started looking for ways just to preserve my own sanity. So that's when I got involved with the Palo Alto Zen Center and the meditation community. I'd been practicing yoga. I ended up starting to teach yoga that first year as a way of finding some kind of community on campus that wasn't related to my research or to the stress of the academic side. I was taking classes in the dance department, and I started to explore in research and in academic coursework this more humanistic side of medicine as well, the mind-body relationship. So the way that it kind of started with me curious about psychology and how the mind works, and especially how the mind and body are related. And then I was getting involved in so many activities and so many organizations in the local community where I had an opportunity to do things that were healing for me.
So when did you land at Stanford?
99.
And tell me about your dissertation, because that was sort of the initial focus.
Yeah.
I mean, when you came, did you know what it was going to be about?
I did not. And the funny thing is, I actually didn't know what my dissertation was going to be about until after I'd already written my whole dissertation proposal, because I'd planned to study one thing, which was the relationship between optimism, personal optimism, and how we build social resources, how the way that we think helps us connect to others and develop social support. And one of the other researchers on the team accidentally or on purpose deleted my key measures. So we had all of this data we'd been collecting in a longitudinal study, except my key measures weren't in it. So I had to switch what I was doing my dissertation on at the very last minute and find other data sets. So I ended up doing my dissertation on how the different ways that we regulate difficult emotions like anger or sadness or anxiety, how that influences our personal well-being, including health and how we find social support in our communities. So that was a little bit of an interesting switch, and it ended up fitting in very well with the work that I do in terms of teaching meditation and teaching psychology and teaching people healthy ways to deal with difficult emotions and stress.
So instead of starting out with the notion of optimism and the positive, you went from how do people deal with something challenging?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, because one of the key themes in all the work that I do is there's sort of the two sides of it. I spend a lot of time helping people who are suffering, either from depression or anxiety or chronic physical pain, and helping them relieve their suffering a little bit. And then there's this other side, like the dance classes, where it's really all just about the positive emotions, having fun, bringing joy into our lives. And so it's been really nice to be able to get to do both.
I went by Euphoria the other day, where I know you teach a Zumba class, and they were describing the difference about what they do as sort of having this sense of soul and community and fun. So it sounds like that's a lot of what you're, that other side that you're injecting.
It is,
in.
and when I found that studio and they just opened up this year, I was so grateful to have a place that focuses on the joy of exercise and working out as an opportunity for social connection, because that's everything that I do. I think that should also be part of it, that we're getting together as a group and there's social bonds that are forming and support systems that are forming there.
Do you live in Palo Alto now?
I do. I live in downtown Palo Alto.
So that ends up being a very much integrated into your community as well.
Yes, I can walk everywhere that I teach, which is fantastic.
And as a non-driver.
And as a non-driver, that is very important. But it also means I get to see people in the community. I mean, it really makes a difference when I will see my students at Whole Foods or walking down the street. When you mention that my personal life, my work life probably don't seem separate, I think that's actually really wonderful, that it just sort of feels like I'm participating in community all the time.
Are there seeds of all this in your own childhood that shaped you, do you think? Any particular experiences?
Yeah, and probably on both sides of that spectrum, the suffering and the positive. I vowed to become a group fitness instructor when I was in 3rd grade, and I was in the basement doing leg lifts to Pat Benatar, and I said, this is fantastic, this is what I want to do with my life, which my parents, who were both educators, my mom's a college professor, I think that maybe they weren't thrilled about the idea that I wanted to be a group fitness instructor, but so the seeds for that were there very early on, as well as meditation. I went to a Quaker private school, and starting in kindergarten, they would have us sit on the benches and be still. And I feel like I really picked up an appreciation for being with yourself in your own mind in stillness and also in community at the same time through that Quaker schooling. And then in terms of what drew me into health psychology, I've experienced chronic pain for most of my life, starting in early childhood, and having daily headaches that were often completely debilitating and unexplained, which probably were stress related. And so I was always looking for ways to try to improve my health or relieve stress, and sort of landed at Stanford with that idea in mind. That I got interested in psychology because I kind of knew what it was like to be in pain and to want some sort of freedom from that.
Now your appointment, instead of being in the psychology department as a professor, is at the Center for Compassion and Altruism?
Yes, the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, which we just call CCARE. I am a curriculum developer and a senior teacher for CCARE, and the curricula that I create are to help train people to cultivate their own qualities of compassion, empathy, altruism, and cooperation. And we've been studying that program scientifically for a couple of years now. We're just starting to write up and publish the research results on that. But it's been really amazing so far to see the positive effects people are getting from doing these meditation practices, that people are not just becoming more compassionate, but they're feeling more connected to others, less depressed, less anxious, and all sorts of other positive outcomes.
Can you talk about your book that's coming out in January, the Willpower Instinct?
Yeah, so this is based on a class that I launched at Stanford University that is called Science of Willpower. And I created that class for the Continuing Studies program because in my job as a health educator for the Health Improvement Program at the School of Medicine, I was going all over campus, to departments, and teaching classes and lectures about what people could do to improve their health. And I started to hear back, we know that already. We know we're supposed to exercise and eat right and sleep more, and we don't want to do it. We keep hoping you're going to come and tell us something that we actually want to do. And I thought, you know what, people know what they need to do. Deep down they want to do it, but they don't have any idea how to implement the change. So I created this class that was all about the latest research on how do you make behavior changes, whether it's starting to exercise or giving up smoking or overcoming procrastination.
So how do you?
Well, you have to get the book, I think, or take the class, which I'm going to be offering again at Continuing Studies in January. But the fun thing about that class is, again, it's using the science to understand why it is that it's so hard to do these things and to really appreciate how human it is to struggle with addiction and temptation and procrastination, and then use the findings of the studies to create support for ourselves.
Can you share one little example?
One of the things that people tend to be most surprised by is how important it is to be more forgiving with yourself rather than stricter with yourself. A lot of people use self-criticism, shame and guilt as a motivating tool to make a change, and the research is crystal clear that guilt makes you feel worse, shame makes you feel worse. The harder you are on yourself for whatever the behavior is you want to change, or especially if you have a setback, like you eat too much at lunch and you're on a diet, the harder you are on yourself and the worse you feel about it, the more likely you are to then just completely spiral out of control. And so one of the things we do in that class is develop skills and things you can do to forgive yourself and develop a kind of inner mentor rather than the critic who's so often in charge of these self-improvement programs.
I know you use yoga as a therapeutic tool and believe in that for some of the things you were talking about, chronic pain and chronic challenges like depression. But I'm just curious about where you see that evolving, and since I don't know what the graph would look like if you saw how many people are practicing yoga in the West now as compared to even 10 years ago. But can you just talk about that in general?
I got into practicing yoga really early. I was a kid at home with a yoga VHS tape doing boat pose in the living room when I was like 10 years old. So I got started the way a lot of people did, just thinking that yoga was some kind of workout. And then when I was in college, I stress and everything that college is. I returned to yoga looking for it to be a stress relief, some way to take care of myself. Came out to Stanford, and that was when there was really a renaissance going on in a form of yoga that is very athletic, almost gymnastic-like, and I ended up getting involved in that community. But I started to notice in my teaching that it was an inappropriate practice for 99% of people. And a lot of people who would come to a class for the first time would never come back because it wasn't safe, it wasn't accessible. And so I started to shift my teaching more toward the people who were having a hard time finding a class in the Bay Area, and started to study yoga therapy more systematically. And so now my teaching has evolved to really look at how we can offer a practice that is accessible to anybody, whether you can get out of bed or not, whether you're in a wheelchair or not, whether you've got a bad back or not, and focus on the key practices of yoga that are healing. Breathing, moving while you breathe, meditation, relaxation, in a socially supportive community.
How about a little bit about the research that you're doing? You've touched on that with willpower, but I understand you're doing some research with some Tibetan monks and meditation, and kind of the phrase that you use to describe what you do is where science and compassion meet. Mm-hmm. And might that be one of those places? And is there anything that you're finding or that's just maybe even delightful about working with these Tibetan monks?
So the research that I'm working on with that is with the Compassion Cultivation training program, where we're bringing people in from the community and teaching them these traditional Tibetan mind training practices of cultivating loving kindness and compassion and empathy. And I was thrilled to be invited in when they were first, when CCARE was first designing this program. The lead designer was Thupten Jinpa, who's the senior translator for the Dalai Lama. And he wanted to collaborate with psychologists and neuroscientists at Stanford to really infuse what was a traditional training, to infuse that with what we know about how the mind works, why it's difficult to feel compassion for people sometimes. And so a few years ago, we put together this program, and I've been teaching it to undergraduates at Stanford and to a lot of different populations. And CCARE is about to start a program in the VA with veterans. And so we're moving sort of out beyond the general population. And the key findings that we've seen so far are that training the mind in this way to connect with the suffering of others really reduces one's own suffering, experiencing less depression and anxiety and loneliness and more compassion for others and for yourself.